Okay, good afternoon. I would like to get this show started. My name is Rick Spear. I'm the library director here, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the Lewiston Public Library and to the Great Falls Forum. As many of you know, the Great Falls Forum is a partnership of Bates College, the Sun Journal, and the library. And we try and get a wide range of speakers on a variety of public policy issues, but we also bring in the business leaders, academia, the arts. We're a pretty wide-ranging lecture series. Just a couple of announcement type things. With the upcoming end-of-year holidays, we kind of scale back our library programming, so there's not a whole lot to announce coming up right away. But I will say, for those of you who are interested and not on our adult events email list to get email notifications of programs like this, we're really easy to get hooked up with. Just go to our webpage, events and programs, and sign up. And if you have any questions at all, see me and I can facilitate that for you. I'm also going to put in a plug for the Friends of the Library, because the Friends help underwrite this series and a lot of the public programming we do. They're in the middle of their annual membership campaign. If you're not a current member, we would love to see you sign up. Memberships start as low as $15 a year for seniors. And we'd love to have your support. And the next Great Falls Forum, we skipped December with the end of year holidays, but the next forum will be on Thursday, January 21st with Maine Attorney General Janet Mills. So today we are very honored to have Penobscot Nation Chief Kirk Francis with us. Kirk is entering his 10th year as leader of the Penobscot tribe, and was first elected to the position in 2006 and has been re-elected 3 times. 2015 marks the first time since 1842, and that's a long time. This is the first year that all of Maine's Native American tribes were not represented in the Maine state legislature. This followed a decision last spring by the Passamaquoddies and the Penobscots to remove their representative back in May, after yet another period of failed communications and interactions between the state of Maine and the sovereign tribes within our state. To many Maine citizens, these recent failures are embarrassing and more than a little bit confusing. They're not real easy to follow. On the surface, back in 2011, things were looking pretty good. Governor LePage signed a new executive order that recognized a, quote, special relationship between the state and the tribes. Among other directives in that order, he instructed all state agencies to include a tribal liaison to facilitate communication and include the voice and interest of the Native peoples in all state agency activities. Then, earlier this year, LePage rescinded the order. This followed the receipt of a letter that the state received from the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, which supported the Penobscot Nation's position on Penobscot River water rights and water quality issues. In addition to rescinding the executive order, the governor then threatened to sue the EPA and subsequently took steps to exert even more state control over Penobscot land and water rights. It kind of was the final straws that broke the back, and the Passamaquoddies and Penobscots at that point decided it's enough for now and walked away from the legislature. Chief Francis is one of the youngest chiefs in Penobscot tribal history. However, he's been involved in tribal government both politically and programmatically for a very long time. Prior to his election as chief, Kirk served for 3 consecutive terms on the Penobscot Tribal Council. Chief Francis has become knowledgeable and effective in dealing with a wide range of issues. And this fall, Kirk was one of 11 tribal leaders invited to meet with President Obama to talk about environmental, labor, and other issues facing the Native tribes nationally. Our speaker is born and raised on Indian Island, where he lives today. He's married, the father of 5, a talented hockey player. This is not his first time to Lewiston, he informs me. An avid outdoorsman and a passionate golfer. So please join me in welcoming Chief Kirk Francis.
Well, good afternoon, and I really appreciate being here, as mentioned, and I appreciate that introduction. I wasn't so good a hockey player that we didn't lose every time we came to this town. It was such a memorable experience for me. But I think that the opportunity to be here and talk to you about these issues is extremely important to us as a tribe, that we try to educate as many people as possible about the challenges the tribes face. Many times you get the news clip in and, you know, this is a fight over slot machines, or it's a fight over this or that. It's a much deeper issue than I think most people realize. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the tribe's perspective on sovereignty, and also some examples, some of the ones that were spoken about in the introduction, and kind of how we got to where we are today. I will preface that by saying that you know, there are many good people in Augusta. There are good representatives in Augusta. Some of them come right from this town that have tried to work with the tribes to try to create a structural setup that had some legitimacy and integrity in a process that recognized the unique relationship we have with the state of Maine and the federal government. So with that, I'll talk at you a little bit, and then I'll stay here as long as I'm allowed, and have some dialogue if people have questions. So as was mentioned, I was born and raised on Indian Island. I grew up with a Penobscot father and a French mom, and have one brother, and lived probably a half a mile from the seat of our tribal government, council chambers, and always took an interest in tribal government. My father was 20 plus years on the tribal council, so politics was very much part of our life. So at 21, I ran for office and won by a landslide of 3 votes. And so I tried to go about my time on the tribal council in a very objective way, and fortunately people saw fit to keep electing me. And I will just say before I begin too, I just want to acknowledge my friend Paul Bazalka, who's here as a Penobscot tribal member, and also probably one of the best chairman of the Maine Indian Tribal State Commission we've had in my time anyway, so I just want to acknowledge Paul. So any discussion about sovereignty can get complicated very quickly and very hard to understand. So rather than really trying to engage with you today on a legalistic discussion of sovereignty, I wanted to focus on the foundations of the concept of self-governance and self-determination. The right of any independent group or society to govern itself, free from outside interference, and how we as Native tribes continue to struggle for our proper sovereign status to be recognized and respected. You know, the 1980 Indian Land Claim Settlement Act created a unique legal relationship between the Passamaquoddy tribe, the Penobscots, and the state of Maine. This modern day treaty was intended to enhance the sovereignty of the Maine tribes and promote self-governance, but it has failed miserably. The United States Senate report heralded the Settlement Act, and one of the comments made was, from this day forward, the tribes of Maine will be forever free from state interference. Support for tribal sovereignty can also be found in the United States Constitution, federal statutes, executive orders, and numerous court cases. Of course, the reality for the Penobscot Nation, since we entered into this treaty, has been less than full respect of that sovereignty. So while our native nations are making great progress, we are still very much under attack by outside corporate and government interests in our internal affairs. So while the focus of my discussion is self-governance, I also want to include examples of how that interference has affected the tribes today. So tribal sovereignty really is rooted in the recognition that Indian tribes are distinct political entities, with governments long predating the United States, and as such possess an inherent right to govern themselves. Tribal sovereignty is very much about self-governance and who gets to make the decisions about governance, how we choose our leaders and form of government, who gets to decide land ownership, and a myriad of issues related to governance. Of course, our answer is we do. And at one time, there was really no question about that. About what is now called Maine. It obviously rested with the native tribes as this area's first people being here since time immemorial. The Wabanaki came together as distinct societies and communities, and the power to govern emanated from ourselves, our people, and the Creator. For Indian people, when we discuss sovereignty, we are talking about cultural survival and who we are as a people. We have to take responsibility for ourselves and our resources. Our right to do so must be recognized, because when others make these decisions for us, it never turns out in a positive way. History has proven time and time again that others' decision-making processes do not consider the unique cultures of the tribe or perspectives, and really, how could it? The worldview is really totally different. So, the tribes were boards of the state up until the 1970s and struggled just to survive during that period of time. Our native communities have been historically some of the poorest in the state, with high unemployment, high substance abuse rate, high infant mortality, and low life expectancy. Today at Penobscot, the average age of death is 57. It is interesting to look back at old state statutes contained in Title 22 that regulated every aspect of tribal life, down to the dogs roaming at large. This paternalistic approach is also evident in the legal system. In a case decided by the Maine Supreme Judicial Court, Murch versus Toma, the court said in reference to the tribe, imbecility on their part and the dictate of humanity on ours have necessarily prescribed them, they're subjected to our paternal control. It is only within the last 35 years that the tribes have started the process of taking charge of our own destinies and began to emerge from the difficulty of living under state control and termination era policies such as boarding schools, urban relocation, allotment, the Adoption Act, and a few. We have done this through self-governance and self-determination. We understood the Settlement Act to recognize our right to govern ourselves free from state intrusion. Unfortunately, these habits have died hard, and we still see this continued effort to control us. In 2006, and something Paul knows very well, we embarked on a tribal state work group created pursuant to an executive order of the governor and comprised of state and tribal leaders to identify the problems with the Settlement Act and focus on potential solutions to address them. From the tribe's perspective, this effort reinforced that this document has strayed from its original intent and has been used to try to perpetuate us as political subdivisions of the state. A report was generated that outlined concerns with the settlement and contained several recommendations for positive change. Although the tribes felt these recommendations fell woefully short of fully addressing the issues of sovereignty, we viewed them as a step in the right direction, and we participated in good faith. These proceedings included testimony by state negotiators of the Settlement Act that stated that the document is not set in stone and that they always knew that it would one day have to be revisited and changes likely to be necessary. This idea seems fairly self-evident. Otherwise, why would Congress have specifically provided in the Act for the right of the parties to make changes? So basically, Congress relinquished its plenary authority in this area over the tribes of Maine to allow the state and the tribes to have agreement and to make changes. The recommendations of the work group went to the State Legislative Committee of Jurisdiction, the Judiciary Committee. However, in the end, not one of the recommended changes were adopted by the committee. So our sense is that the state is simply not prepared to recognize us as sovereigns. This triggered my tribe to announce very publicly that we were severing all ties with state government and that we would no longer participate in its proceedings, because to do so, we felt legitimized their process over our affairs and allowed the continued marginalization of our people and very much minimized our government. The Maine Indian Tribal State Commission, which was created by the Settlement Act to continually review the effectiveness of it and the social, economic, and legal relationship between the state and the tribes, and basically to help resolve issues between parties, has been largely ineffective, due primarily to state government's unwillingness to give due consideration to its decisions. The state government seemingly prefers to go to court. A lot of times the tribes get taken to state court, rather than engaging in a true government-to-government resolution process, a role MITSIC was not only envisioned to facilitate, but is statutorily bound to do. The example that first comes to mind is the issue involving wastewater regulation by the state of Maine, pursuant to the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System program under the Federal Clean Water Act, often referred to as NIPDES. The background of this case is that Maine applied to EPA for control over the issuance of all wastewater discharge permits in Maine. Since such a delegation by EPA to the state would have significant impacts on tribal water resources, the tribes became involved in that process, opposing this delegation, at least as it applied to reservation waters. Our opposition being grounded primarily in that the federal government owes to us a trust responsibility to protect our lands and resources, while the state has no such obligation and has acted in total disregard of our concerns. Seemingly because of concerns about this tribal role, the paper companies, through their attorneys and pursuant to Maine's Freedom of Access law, served requests upon the Penobscot Nation and Passamaquoddy tribe requesting access to tribal documents related to communications between the tribes and the federal and state representatives about this NIPDES matter. When the tribes refused, based on their view that such law did not apply to them because it was an intrusion upon tribal government in violation of the terms of the Settlement Act, the companies sued the tribes, keeping in mind that it was intended we would be forever free. Even though the expressed application of the laws to governments and the Settlement Act clearly designates tribal government as an internal tribal matter, not subject to the regulation of the state, a Maine Superior Court judge determined this state law does indeed apply to us and threatened tribal leaders with jail if they chose to uphold their oath in tribal law and protect tribal documents. On appeal, the Maine Supreme Judicial Court likewise concluded that this law, in part, does apply to the Maine tribes, and that we must turn documents over to the paper companies. Now, this is an interesting decision. I mean, this is not even about our relationship and status with another government. This is about the tribe, the tribal sovereign, having to turn over documents to the company. And so, interestingly, MITSIC had twice determined that freedom of access did not apply to the tribes, reasoning tribes are responsible to their citizens in this matter, but to no one else. By the way, the documents requested could have been obtained through the EPA. Further, the tribe has its own Freedom of Information ordinance that provides members with access to tribal government documents, as well as limited access to non-members. Of note, a federal case involved in the NIPDES delegation to the state was also lost. The federal courts determined it was appropriate for EPA to delegate full authority to the state for all discharges, even those on the reservation. The courts concluded that the state has regulatory authority over all waters, even those in Indian country. With the stroke of the pen, the federal courts took away the ability of the Maine tribes to have a meaningful voice. And for some, that really wasn't a huge deal, but for the tribe, it was tragic. So we are a riverine people and have relied on the river and its resources for thousands of years. We care deeply about the river, its health and vitality. Our reservation includes the islands and the river itself, and our way of life is tied to its resources. With the state in control of how the river is managed, it had become degraded and polluted, including the fish that live within it. Fish that our people had relied on for food had now become contaminated. What has been the cultural and human health loss of that situation to the tribe? I doubt anyone can truly quantify that. The paper companies were not concerned about documents when they filed those requests with the tribes. They knew we would resist that intrusion. They wanted to get that issue into courts where they could make arguments to establish that the Settlement Act diminished our rights as a tribal government. I believe it was part and parcel of a strategy to eliminate the tribe's voice for the river. And you might ask yourself why. Well, because they feared if tribal rights to influence how the river is managed were recognized, it would create additional financial responsibilities to the companies because the tribes would press to ensure the river was protected. So on one side, it was really all about money, and for us, it was about a lot more. Unfortunately, this example was only the beginning of a concerted effort to separate us from the river. In 2012, the Penobscot tribe, after centuries of exercising its treaty reserve fishing rights in the Penobscot River, received a letter from the Attorney General's office saying that right no longer existed, despite an opinion from that same office earlier that it did exist. We had to protect ourselves and are currently in federal district court on this issue. Also, the United States has intervened on our behalf and on their own over violations of the Settlement Act and federal Indian law. Simultaneously, the United States Environmental Protection Agency was asked by the state of Maine to determine whether Maine controlled all of Maine waters and had sole authority to set water quality standards. The EPA ruled that the state indeed did possess this authority. However, they stated that the Maine standards had to recognize tribal fishing and subsistence uses, and therefore, within our territories, they must have more stringent standards that acknowledged and enhanced human health criteria. Having the authority really wasn't enough. The state of Maine is now suing EPA over this tribal protection in the decision. And we've seen this in multiple areas, right? In the tribe trying to exercise its authority to protect people, its resources. In 2013, the Violence Against Women Act was passed that put tribal provisions in that bill that would allow tribes to prosecute non-Indian offenders. At our reservation, 1 in every 3 women will be assaulted at some point in their life. That's what the statistics tell us. And 85% of the time, non-Indians are the offenders. So and that's nationally pretty solid statistics. So what the Congress said was local and first responders are the best way to deal with this. So our court was chosen as one of 4 courts in the country to implement the pilot project on the Violence Against Women Act. And when we filed our application, the Attorney General's office objected, and we have not been able to implement those provisions. Another law that was passed was the Tribal Law and Order Act, which recognized tribal communities were becoming havens for drug dealers and a whole host of things because of gaps in the legal system. So the enhanced authority allowed for deeper prosecutions in terms of sentences and also fines. So when we tried to implement that, we tried to create agreements with the prison system, and we were also blocked on that. The Stafford Act was also passed in 2012, which allowed for direct requests to the president by tribal communities. The tribal communities would have to assume the cost share on that, and not the state of Maine, and to declare it a disaster within the Penobscot territory. And again, when we were working with FEMA on that issue, the state objected, and we could not implement that program. So there is a whole host of things beyond what we read in terms of gaming gets all of the stuff, right? Gets all of the attention. But this really is a much broader issue, and it's an environmental issue, it's a human health issue, it's an ability to protect the people that are dealing with huge disparities, both in healthcare and also in many other areas. So the Penobscot Nation has not harvested salmon for subsistence since 1988 due to lack of numbers and the condition of the river, making the fish unfit to eat. We are still under fish consumption advisory. This is not and cannot really be acceptable and shouldn't be allowed to happen. On one hand, the state sometimes agrees we have these fishing rights, and on the other hand, they're saying it's our right to use the river as kind of a waste dump for big industry, without a thought to the cultural and physical health of Penobscot people. Again, this goes back to the patriarchal mindset of we will decide what's best for you, even if it means losing your way of life. It demonstrates to us time and again that when others decide things for us, it does not result in the best interest of the Penobscot Nation. And again, how could it? For tribal people, we have really reached a point where we feel like we cannot compromise on these issues anymore. If we are to survive as a distinct culture with a unique contribution to this country and to this state, we have already been deprived of the ability to live our culture within our traditional homeland, which at one time numbered into the millions of acres. By the time of the Settlement Act, we were reduced to around 75 miles of islands and the surrounding river, which makes up our reservation. Through provisions of the Settlement Act, we have been able to recover a little over 100,000 acres of our Aboriginal Penobscot territory, which we've had to purchase back. Even then, the state tells us that our ability to govern that territory is limited by state interests. It just doesn't make sense to us that after having lost so much of our territory and culture, why they would continue to resist any recognition of tribal authority and contest so fiercely every inch of the tribe's struggle for self-determination. The message to the tribes is that the mindset of many is still in this forced assimilation and termination mindset. And of course, for us, that effort has to be met with equally fierce resistance for the survival of our people and to preserve a future for the yet unborn to exercise their inherent right to exist as a Penobscot. With the tribes exercising increased self-determination for more than 3 decades, we are finally starting to thrive again. For example, we've improved housing. We have constructed numerous new houses on the reservation. We've built apartment buildings for single and small families. We have units designated for elders. We have our own assisted living center to allow some of our most vulnerable elders to continue to live in our community. We have our own healthcare system providing medical, dental, nutrition, diabetes, prevention, laboratory services, counseling services, as well as a pharmacy. We have also taken steps in improving our economic condition. And as a government, we employ over 200 people, and our economic development efforts are starting to create real opportunity for our citizens and increase revenue for our nation. We expect our business development to grow significantly over the next 5 years, which will provide, hopefully, regionally, hundreds of jobs and economic self-sufficiency for our tribe. We once again are encouraging our citizens to embrace their culture through language revitalization and many cultural programs. The tribe is getting back to recognizing the voice of our women, children, and elders who have played a vital role in our history and are so important to the prosperity of our community today. We are focusing on our educational systems, trying to create more opportunities for our people to attend some of Maine's best institutions, to which we've had limited access to in the past. We've expanded our internal social programs to focus on cultural healing and emphasizing the elimination of dependency in any area. We have our own judicial system, featuring a tribal court, where our citizens are dealt with in a tribal environment, as well as our own public safety, warden service, and fire protection departments. Our largest department, which is at the very core of our culture, is our natural resource department. It focuses on the many aspects of our environment, from water and air quality to managing all our resources in a sustainable and responsible way. All of these activities are the result of self-governance and self-determination. We are providing for ourselves and our community, because despite other people's perceptions or misperceptions of who we are, and whatever stereotypical images they may hold of tribal people, our communities do not want handouts, nor are we interested in being perpetual victims. And many of our people do not ask for assistance at all. The Wabanaki tribes are comprised of people possessing great character, integrity, and responsibility, and only want what's best for their families and communities. Our people care about this state. It is our homeland, and we are connected to it. We want it to prosper, and we must be an equal player in accomplishing that goal. However, it should and must be on the terms that reflect our unique culture and perspective. Without this opportunity, it's my firm belief our state will never truly reach its potential, economically, socially, or spiritually. And we will continue to live in an era of conflict, disharmony, and distrust. It is time we put these things behind us. So sovereignty may mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, but for Penobscots, I can define it in 2 ways. First, sovereignty means what it always did, to our people, and that is the right to exist freely and exercise our own decision-making process in order to live our culture and shape our own future. And secondly, and the piece we don't really like too much, is we recognize that we also have a continued struggle to obtain recognition and acknowledgement of that right. So as I said in my opening statement, any discussion of sovereignty can get complicated very quickly. But to Native people, it is quite simple, and it comes down to one basic question. Who gets to decide the things that affect our lives? Although it seems like the answer to that question should be crystal clear to everyone, until it is, I'm afraid our vision of walking together to a better tomorrow for all people, even though on different paths, can never truly be realized. Such a result would truly be a shame, because we miss out on the opportunity for a better future for all, a future of mutual respect, of tolerance, and increased prosperity. It has been my absolute pleasure to talk to you today about this issue. I hope you get a sense of some of the challenges that the tribe is facing, and I hope you take away that sovereignty comes down to that one basic question: who gets to decide? And I hope you appreciate the tribe's belief that we hold that decision-making process for ourselves. So thank you. I forgot my glasses today, so that's a struggle. How do you do? Hi.
Hi. What would have to happen for you to be back in conversation with the governor or the administration?
Mm-hmm.
What would have to happen for you?
Well, I think, the tribes are really at a place right now where we need to see real tangible results. I mean, I think we need to see that, and I'm not talking about getting what we want or any of those things. I'm talking about a structural setup within state government that enhances the government-to-government relationships with tribes in a productive way. For example, an Office of Indian Affairs within state government, an office that, because one of the things we really struggle with is who is the relationship with. Sometimes we can work fine with the governor's office to have the Attorney General say, no way, right? And then sometimes we're working great in the legislature to have governors veto bills. So who is that government-to-government relationship? And it's my so it's my firm belief that tribal leaders and tribal governors shouldn't be sitting in legislative committees trying to resolve high-level government-based decisions. And so I don't think that system's conducive to productivity that way, because it's a constituent-driven business in the legislature, and so we can't really focus on, for example, in the federal government, you have the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. That's all they focus on is Indian-based issues. Not perfect by any means, and it's still very political, but I think it's a structural setup within the federal system that elevates this relationship. So, yes, sir.
Do other states have similar problems with their water rights and other issues? Or?
Yeah, there's certainly conflict in other places. I think that Maine is uniquely on the short list of very bad places, though, on these issues. I mean, there are probably maybe 3 states that rank as low in tribal state relations as Maine does. And they do, at the National Congress of American Indians, I chair their Natural Resource Committee. It's their largest committee with 283 tribes in that. And we don't hear these types of problems. Matter of fact, people have a hard time on it, even as we start to educate Congress about these issues, really have a hard time understanding how that can be happening here. But they do a ranking anyway of states and their tribal state relationships, and Maine's unfortunately always has a problem with that. Whoops, we'll go right back there.
Can I ask you, please, how did it happen with the elder situation, that when they became so such a moneymaker, that the tribes were told to cut back on theirs? I didn't understand that. I don't agree with it. Nobody was using many elders before, so explain that.
if you look at the Elver situation, Passamaquoddies actually had had legislation that supported their rights to fish elk, saltwater-based fish, and marine fish for in their own dam. They could regulate it, do whatever they wanted to do. So that was actually in state law. So when the Elvers really started to get lucrative, as you mentioned, they had to address that law because I don't know why. And it was too bad because they acknowledged the fishing right back then and then said, we don't want to acknowledge it anymore because a lot of money came into play. I really don't know what drove that, except they were looking to, I think the state really was under a lot of pressure too because they were restricting their own fishing. They had a limited amount of permits out there. They weren't given any more. And they started getting a lot of complaints that tribes shouldn't be able to do whatever they want with their permits. And again, you get this intrusion into self-governance. And, you know, so I think money drove a lot of that stuff. But I think if they were worth $10 a pound, nobody would have cared, right? Yeah.
I was interested in the notion of sovereignty, and I've heard people say that sovereignty is all or nothing, as opposed to sovereignty as a kind of a range or a spectrum. And all the topics you've discussed, I'm completely supportive of Penobscot claims, but I was curious if you'd acknowledge some limits to sovereignty in terms of Penobscot passports or Penobscot representatives to the United Nations and those sort of larger issues that some tribes have asserted.
Right, so I think, I don't think there is any such thing really as a partial sovereign. And you can equate it to any country in the world, right? But I will say this, I mean, you have to exercise, like anybody that's a sovereign, you have to exercise that sovereignty in a responsible way. You have to recognize the interests of others, and all we've really been saying all along is, let's have a conversation about the middle ground here. What's the compromise? We recognize we're in a coexisting society. A lot of people care about the river, not just the Penobscots. A lot of people use the river. We want to promote that. We want to be good partners. We just want that unique and distinct culture that lives within that river to be recognized and respected. So I think being a sovereign comes with a lot of responsibility, and you cannot be irresponsible with it. And I think, you know, creating good partnerships and all of that is extremely important. You know, one act of a sovereign is to create memorandums of understanding and agreements with other towns, you know, cities, states, whatever it is. I mean, I think those are all legitimate conversations that need to take place. It's just when you're left out of that conversation and told you're not going to be able to do anything, then I think that's where the problem comes in.
Has Maine always been at the bottom of the list, or is this a new development?
Well, yeah, I mean, unfortunately, previously as wards of the state, you know, you had a lot of corruption, you had a lot of abuse, you know, you had Indian agents, you had a lot of things going on. You had, you know, kids, Wabanaki kids being sent away from their communities, you know, bad adoptions, bad policy, a whole host of things. So I don't know that it's ever been good, but I would say right now, it's kind of as bad as I've ever seen it. And I think that, because they're not even having a political conversation at this point. I mean, so okay, is that better?
No. Lift it up more.
Test it.
I didn't do that on purpose.
We have been having problems with the system, and it's,
I'll try to switch.
yeah, sorry about that. Where were we again?
Has it been better or worse?
Oh, yeah, so I think, you know, at least before, even if it was a tough political process or whatever, we were at least talking and trying to get through things. And as I said, you know, right now, there's just nothing going on. And when I talk about, the state, I mean, I know, you know, these are institutional problems. I mean, there are great people there trying to do the right thing, as I mentioned. But I think right now it's extremely tough because there's just no conversation. So, yeah.
I'm not sure if I see the connection between the lumber companies and the conservation. I must have missed something here.
Well, where that connection comes in is in the water quality area, right? You have paper companies discharging into river systems. So, and then trying to get recognition for subsistence-based lifestyle. We recognize that economic activity is important, you know. And I got friends in Old Town that work in those mills that are closing, and it's a shame. I mean, but what we're saying is that we have to recognize a human health criteria and make sure that we're utilizing that resource responsibly, so we can figure out a way to coexist and everybody kind of gets what they want in that regard. So,
From your speech, it sounds as if neither the state courts nor the federal courts are, well, they're neither sympathetic nor are they construing the settlement statute in a straight and fair and impartial way. Is that correct? And is there anything?
well, I mean, I don't.
With the federal courts, for example, and the state courts?
So I think, to be fair, the Settlement Act has extremely tough language, a lot of ambiguity in the Settlement Act, a lot of things that can be argued to whatever worldview you want to argue to. But I think there's a lot of evidence within the act that the tribe's view of, we're not always right. I'm always right, but we're not. But I think it's you know, we don't always get it right either. But I think that the courts really struggle with this issue. And I think that it's hard for, you know, many times the tribe has just been up against the state in courts. We really have no federal trustee help in those cases until recently. And so now what you're seeing is with the EPA water quality decisions, with, you know, Department of Interior, Department of Justice, and the United States themselves suing the state. I mean, that's a big deal. States have constitutional protection against that. And for the United States to come in on something like that is pretty historic. And I think it really lends, I think, to the credibility of this case in terms of where the settlement act is. But they've been tough on the issue.
Are the ambiguities, or have the ambiguities been rather routinely construed against the tribe?
Yes, and I think and this is what we were trying to fix with the work groups, right? We were really trying to tighten up a lot of the language, make sure we were recognizing what rights the tribes had, didn't have. No question the tribe made compromises in some, but to suggest that the tribes gave up their governmental authority, they gave up their fishing rights in the Penobscot River, they gave up all of it, it's just, you know, it's just not true. So I think there is a unique jurisdictional framework that has to be acknowledged, but at the same time, you know, it goes way too far. Sir.
In the way of economic development, I read some of your online stuff and see the Penobscot Support Services and the Holding Company and your efforts in economic development. Are there any areas that you feel more optimistic about, or any new things that you're going into that seem to have a better light?
So we have 9 subsidiaries in our corporation now. We deal with everything from federal government contracting, military contracting, to alternative conservation services, we do a whole host of things. So we have two 8A certified companies, which allows us to get preferential contractual agreements within the Department of Defense and others. And we're in 6 states now, and we have contracts predominantly in Texas and Virginia, Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. So we're doing much better there. We gotta really figure out from a revenue standpoint and from a company standpoint, doing very well there. We just figure out how to get that locally. And I think that trying to get work away from depots and today is challenging because a lot of those areas have high unemployment rate. And they want to keep that work in those states. So we're trying to work through some of those, but I'm really optimistic that we have some short-term manufacturing opportunities, and so we're working on those. So I think between manufacturing and then trying to do, in all of the subsidiaries we have, 50 megawatt wind farm we're looking at developing, between all of those things, and putting on top of that kind of the cultural-based tourism, the ecotourism, all the things that the Penobscot River Restoration Project has opened up to the tribe for guide services. We held a sponsored National Whitewater Canoe Race this year there in Oaktown. So we're building on a lot of those opportunities, but I think the corporation itself is looking very promising. So we've tried to focus in areas that really enhance our federal relationship and kind of cut this piece off. So, go ahead.
So, just going back to the question about ambiguities, I'm curious, one of the big ones for me seems to be that in the Settlement Act, it defines the Penobscot Reservation as the islands. And so how does the Penobscot Nation assert the claim to the river?
Well, you'll notice that we're talking in the case about the main stem of the Penobscot. So the language that says, which is contradictory to multiple treaties, but what it was talking about is, or that view is, in what it's talking about is a geographical location of islands. Those islands, right? It doesn't mean the islands below Milford, it doesn't mean the islands above it, although that's really never been settled, but above Medway, but it really, when it says islands from here to there, it's talking about those islands, making sure that they understood the geographical location of where those islands existed. So there was never any ceding of the river and the river rights. So under federal law, under federal Indian law, never ceded, always retained. And the canons of construction there tell you that when there are ambiguities, you always rule in favor of the tribes. And that's a Supreme Court decision. So those are some of the benefits that tribes in Maine don't get today.
The question that I have listening to you is, given the difficulties that you've had, does the tribe regret agreeing to the land claim settlement?
Yes.
Okay. How could you?
Yeah.
What would you do differently if you were doing it now?
Well, I think, if we went back knowing what we know now, you have to remember the tribes, too, for 5 years almost, were under total federal jurisdiction at that point. They had total sovereign status. They were recognized, federally recognized. We were federally recognized. And there would have been no reason for the tribes to give up their entire sovereign status at that point when they had it. They had it all. This was the land claim itself, right? It was acknowledged that. So it was. So if we went back to negotiate, I think it's just language and trying to make sure that people were more clear about what things meant. And but there's tons of stuff beyond reading the document. There's committee reports, and we've been going through a lot of the congressional reports and people that were speaking on behalf of the tribes, which lends a great deal of credibility to what the tribe's intent was. And you have to remember too that the tribes didn't really agree to that whole document. So there was some, I think, 16 changes to the Settlement Act when it was going through the congressional process, including the one that
had read an article in the Portland Press Herald that a lobstermen association in the Penobscot Bay were concerned about pollution upstream eventually becoming the pollution downstream and in the bay. Are there any political leaders here in the state willing to recognize that as a very real possibility? And are there any supporting your efforts to clean up the river in that regard?
I think so. I mean, I think that what you saw with the mercury situation, right? So what you saw there was we hadn't paid attention to that issue for years, right? Big fight ensued about who was going to clean it up, who wasn't. We started finding it in the lobsters, though. People got aggressive on it, and that decision came out very favorably for the river. And so that cleanup will be underway very soon. So I'm not so sure. Well, we get as much support as the lobsters, but we'll see. Anyone else?
Chief, would you? So you guys, when you withdrew your representatives from the legislature, or your tribal representatives from the legislature, was there a contemplation that it's just good to have someone there to keep an eye on these guys, if you will? You know, I mean, it feels like at one way you were making your protest, but in another way, you're kind of further disadvantaging yourself because you're not able to have those sort of eyes and ears right there, you know, on the ground to watch what they're either doing for you or, you know, against you.
Right, and that's right. I mean, that's the benefit of having a representative there, is to, you know, be able to be there every day, work the bills that are going to be helpful for you, but also to watch out for any collateral damage from other things. I think what we were saying when we pulled our representatives wasn't just some hissy fit, you know, come on. I mean, they've been 200 plus years in the Maine legislature in a very historic situation. So we methodically thought that through, and actually our membership voted by referendum on that. It wasn't just tribal leaders that were involved. So I think the point is that we felt like we just needed to start acting like what we said we were, and that's a sovereign government, not a political subdivision of the state of Maine. So, and especially when those processes really just, we felt like became a mockery after a while. So it was, again, despite the many good people trying to help, and a lot of those representatives, I walked out with them that day, and it was, we have a lot of friends there, and so our goal now is to create ambassador-based positions, those positions, and still have a presence in Augusta, but in a much different way.
Does that require some state legislation for you guys to do that, or you'll just have people there like lobbyists, essentially?
Well, yeah, well, if you call them that, I will. But but they're elected officials within the tribe, and they'll be representatives of the tribe in kind of a government-to-government role. So we see that as a more elevated status for that position. Did you feel undermined that not all the three bands that were, all the three tribes that were there stayed together? The Penobscots and the Passamaquoddies left, but the Maliseet band stayed. Did that undermine the effect of that action? Well, it would have been better if they did, I think, but I can't, you know, I have to respect their independent decision making, and you know, they're a sovereign nation themselves, and on one hand, for us to say and then complain about decisions they make, I mean, that's their business. I mean, I get along great with Chief Commander, and we still have great friendship, and you know, you have to really get that thinking from them. One more, yeah. Turn on the light.
Is there something productive that outraged citizens can do to support the Penobscot and other indigenous people?
And you know, so we're seeing it in the river case, right? partnership with Maine's tribes, and we want to find a common ground so we all can be successful here. I think that's to get listened to residents. So I think those are the things we can do. Thank you all very much.